6:41 p.m., 9/22/2023. Okay. Yesterday, I finished reading Revolutionary Road, the full novel. It's in its entirety. And I put it all in the playlist so people can listen to it as a whole. And did it in like 2 to 3 chapter increments. And I think it turned out pretty well. I tried to check where I started and left off with some, and some of the audio is a little borked, but it's okay. But today I would like to ramble about what I think about it a little bit. And these rambles aren't professional synopses. These aren't well thought out, theses on the novel. I've thought about this novel a lot over the years, and it would probably benefit me to write something a bit more cohesive than a ramble, but I'm just going to ramble. I want to say again that I first came across this work from the film Revolutionary Road, which I believe came out in 2008. And I have the script right here. It's all rights reserved from DreamWorks Limited Liability Company. And the screenwriter is Justin Haythe. And in my opinion, he did an excellent job. And I think this was one of his first. But I'm going to go between the book and the film, which I know is sacrilegious, but I'm going to try to stay true to the book, but I might refer to the script a little bit. I can't even remember how I got the script. I must have found it online somewhere, and it's been collecting dust in a part of my room for a while, but I busted it out, and I'm holding it and looking at it right now. And I might reread this as well to myself, because I think, again, Justin did an excellent job adapting it. I've been thinking about possibly adapting the Easter Parade on my own as a script writing exercise somewhere down the line. I think that'd be interesting to try. But Revolutionary Road essentially is about a couple who find themselves at a point in their lives where they're very clearly unhappy. Not unlike the Easter Parade, where the Grimes sisters would never have a happy life, or would never be happy. I don't think any or I'll say most of the characters in Richard Yates's work are particularly happy. And I think that's what happens when you dive into the genre of realism. If you're going to be honest about what you're writing and what you're going to put your characters through and who they are, it's not going to be happy. But it's honest. So the book begins with a rehearsal of the petrified forest by certain members of the community that think they're apart from the pack. They're in the upper echelon, or they set themselves apart because they're doing this thing that nobody else is doing. And, I think they have a little bit of sense of superiority complex. And I like that we're set up to believe that, this is an amateur thing, but it's going to come off and it's going to be great. And I should mention before I say anything that I'm going to talk, there's going to be spoilers. So if you want to read the book beforehand, I would recommend doing so. But back to what I was saying, it sets up kind of the theme of the entire book, where you are more or less set up to fail. And a local community doing an adaptation of a well-known play like The Petrified Forest that isn't necessarily a big thing. I think it's made big by their superiority complex that they have over all the other citizens of the community. And of course, they're taken down a notch when their belief in themselves and in the play falls on its face. It just doesn't come off well, and that kicks off our introduction to Frank and April as a couple, where they have their first big fight that we see when they pull off the side of the road and are essentially fighting in front of everybody that's leaving the theater. So everybody, they're illuminated by their headlights, and they're taking the well-dubbed Route 12 all back to their homes. So everybody passing them, everybody that was in the audience, which is essentially everybody in the community, is passing them and watching them fight from Route 12. And the beginning of this fight illustrates a lot of what they're upset about. And he's trying to placate her after he's insulted her by saying it's just a play, it's not a big deal, you were the best thing in the play. And she just wants him to shut up so they can move on, but he can't he can't help himself. In this book, I find that the characters are trying to make situations, they're trying to better certain situations. They're trying to put the pieces back together in situations. Pieces that are from some kind of tapestry or a mural or something that's shattered or broken. They're trying to pick up the pieces and put it back how it was. And of course, they never can. But the pieces of the tapestry or the mural are illusions themselves. So again, they're set up to fail. They can't, by that alone, they can't make it better. It's already false because they're living a lie. But the barbs they throw at each other are very real. When they say things like, oh, I just had the page. No, I can't find it. They say things like, I'm not going to play the role of dumb, insensitive husband. And, let's see. And it's not his fault that she didn't turn out to be an actress. And that just kicks it off. The whole play just kicks off their row, essentially. And, you know, and she says, like, just because you got me placed in this little trap and I'm your punching bag, and he comes back at her, you in the trap, don't make me laugh. It's at that point that you realize that they're both in the fucking trap. They're both in the trap, and her one attempt at getting out of it, or getting some body part out of it so that it's not in it, failed. And so it's reiterated why she should be where she is. You're not an actress. You're a homemaker, your wife and your mother. But of course she isn't. But that's what I think the play seemingly proved to Frank and to everybody else who saw her. And he becomes physical during that altercation, but only to the car. And it's like, this is clearly a marriage that has been on the rocks for a long time. This is one fight, and from the dialogue we get between the two, we see that it's one fight of many. When he says, I don't happen to fit the role of dumb, insensitive suburban husband. You've been trying to hang that one on me ever since we moved out here. And that means if the kids are like, I forget their ages, 4 and 6, this has been going on for years, where they've been at each other, and it's been building and building and building and building. And this is one instance in which it's a blow up. It's not the blow up, but it's a pretty significant blow up in their marriage. And it's right at the beginning of the book. So you got to think, okay, where's this going to go? And I have the fan on, and if that's annoying to listen to, I made a choice because it's humid today. But after that, we go to a sequence where we meet the realtor, Mrs. Givings. And all these characters in this book are extraordinary because they all try to do the same thing, but they're different people with different idiosyncrasies and different agendas in their own lives, in which they're trying to piece together that ultimately don't work, even though they do it enough to where they believe it worked and they live that way, and it doesn't work for the people around them, that they're satisfied. They're willfully, ignorantly satisfied. And Mrs. Givings is one of those characters. And I'm gonna interject here and say that everybody in the film version of this did an excellent job. Kate Winslet as April and Leonardo DiCaprio as Frank, Kathy Bates as Mrs. Givings, and Michael Shannon as John Givings, and I forget the husband, Howard Givings. That feels so disrespectful. But I'm going to look it up. I'm going to take time to look it up. He was a veteran actor. He did an excellent job. Everybody did an excellent job in this film. Let's see. But we're introduced to Mrs. Givings, who is a character that's so obnoxious. Yeah. Let's see. Richard Easton as Howard, and Catherine Hahn as Millie, and David Harbour as Shep, and good old Dylan Baker, Jack Ordway, and Zoe Kazan as Maureen. Everybody did an excellent job. Mrs. Givings is relentlessly obnoxious in the most relentlessly polite way. She's a character that you don't have to give her the Emily Post book. It's in her brain, but she'll manipulate it and use it to her advantage to get what she wants. Every comment, everything that comes out of her mouth has this backhandedness to it, to where it's completely disingenuous, although she's selling it as genuine. And on the surface, it feels genuine, but you know she's full of shit. I love it. It's extremely well written, and Kathy Bates did an excellent job in the movie. But we go through a sequence where Mrs. Givings did her job. She's a realtor and she sold the house. And we realized that they were more or less sold a lie. And it's an exchange in the book, in the film, where April says they sold on the premise that we were different or we were exceptional people, but we're not. We're just like everybody else. If you look up the street and down the street, we're in uniform. We fit right in with everybody else, that you can't even see us. And that comes to a point later on when April is talking about the golden people, because essentially, if you're a uniform and you fit right in, I would think you'd be part of the invisible people if you're going to group people in sections. And she's slowly realizing that she's part of the invisible people. Essentially, she's realizing she's been had, and Frank's been had. And there's an important passage in the book about contamination, and I'm baffled why I didn't remember it, because it's extremely important, and I should have dog-eared the page, although I wouldn't want to mess up the book, where I think Frank talks about, with the Campbells, about the contamination of... He's talking about the contamination of the nation, but I think he's talking about the contamination of the... Maybe both. Maybe the nation and the people that they're in close proximity to. And but he's exceptional because he can see it. And the thing about it is, he doesn't see it. He's already been contaminated. Even though he can see it, he can't realize it's already happened. And he isn't a standout. He can see it in other people, but he can't see it in himself. And I don't know if he can't allow himself to, or if he just can't. He doesn't have that ability. And I can't find that passage, but I was baffled that I didn't remember it. But I think that's a very important thing, that the book, it's I think a theme of the book, that all these people are trying to wiggle out of this conformity of the 50s, but it's already too late. They're already dressed the way they're dressed. They're in little ticky-tacky houses. Even though these are the estates, they're just bigger ticky-tacky little boxes. They're just big boxes, but they're still uniform. They're still in line with other people, and they're still contaminated. Let's see. I'm flipping through the book, and I think I'm close to it, but still haven't found it. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I know I'm here. I've got it. I just remembered reading the word contaminated, and I thought that stood out. And I'm right here, I just can't find it. But that's what he's talking about. And even after politics had palled, there had still been the elusive but endlessly absorbing subject of conformity, or the suburbs, or American society today. And Frank would develop the theme. The point is, it wouldn't be so bad if it weren't so typical. It's all the idiots I ride with on the train every day. It's a disease. And the funny thing is, in the book, April and Frank are constantly constantly referred to as the Wheelers. That's part of their contamination. The Wheelers. They're not their own people. They're this globulous creature. They're not individuals. And I think April trying to separate them into two individuals was a threat to Frank's understanding to them as a couple, and a threat to understanding himself as a part of that couple, and as a part of his individuality, which is being part of that couple. I don't think he sees himself beyond his own individuality, beyond being Mr. Frank Wheeler of Frank and April Wheeler, the Wheelers. He can't, like I was saying, he can't see it. He can't see the contamination. And I think the passage, they would all agree, and the happy implication was that they alone, the four of them, were painfully alive in a drugged and dying culture. But they're not. They are, but they've already been had. It's one, even before you come out of the womb, you're already sold a bum deal. And it's your choice as to how long you go willfully not seeing it. If you're aware, if you know, I hate saying this, but if you know, you know. But then the question is, do you choose to see it, or do you choose to ignore it? And that's a big part of this book. It's when they walk with John Givings and they talk about the hopeless emptiness. Many people are on to the emptiness, and maybe those are the people that choose to ignore it, but not many are on to the hopelessness. And maybe those are the ones that choose not to ignore it, but don't do anything about it. And I think April wanted them to be a couple that didn't ignore it, but wanted to do something about it. And the thing about that is, that is completely uncharted territory for everybody. But she was willing to do that than go on living this non-life. So, and I think that was a very important setup in the beginning of the book. Talking of being self-aware, but not self-aware to make moves to change anything. I think, oh God, this is hard to say, but I think a lot, if not most people are like that. I'm like that. You're self-aware, but you don't change anything. So you live the same life. You bitch about the same things. Things that you do have the power to change, but you talk yourself out of it. You convince yourself and everybody else that you can't for XYZ, yada, 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 whatever, but you can't. But you're funneling all your energy into your excuses. You're funneling all your energy under the pressure to conform or to please or to fit in or to slide into some role that is semi-accepted, even if it's lambasted for its conformity. It's a form of acceptance. And I think when they start telling people of the Paris idea and people's reactions to it are everything from denial to horror, that's when Frank starts receding and recoiling from the idea. But moving along, when they start to sit down with Shep and Millie and they start gossiping about John Givings and how Mrs. Givings tried to sell the Wheelers on meeting their son John because John Givings needs outings with people his own age to kind of, I don't know if it's part of the treatment of his quote unquote mental illness, but some kind of positive stimulation. And they start gossiping about it, and April is immediately empathetic to John. And that stuns. April says, God, April said, the state troopers, how awful. And then they all shook their heads in solemn agreement. They were happily gossiping about what a nutcase this guy is, and how much attention and how scandalous it was, and da 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 da. And that would be important um, almost at the end of the book when Millie is yet again gossiping about the death of April, where anything anyone ever amounted to was a bit of gossip, like a piece of meat, because that's what makes life living to these people that willingly ignore their circumstance and need substance to fill like their vacuous lives. They need they need the tragedies of others or the downfalls of others to lift them up. I mean, that's a very basic thought, but I think it's also true. Um, and April talks about how she finally realizes why Mrs. Givings, the realtor, wouldn't quit coming by. She was trying to work up the courage to ask them if they could visit with John. And she finally realized, yeah, that's what it is. And she can't bring herself to. Like, she'll stop by and ask us questions and and give us this box of sedum plantings for the quote unquote messy patch at the end of the drive. It's always a backhanded like proposition or comment. Here's a nice box of flowers for you to fix up that unsightly uh, patch at the end of the drive. You need nicer curb appeal, essentially. So, and as we move along, we're introduced to the Knox building. I think Richard was trying to establish a male character. I was going to say a strong male character, but I don't think he thinks his Frank is strong because he conforms. He conforms in I wanted to say one of the worst ways, but and I think that still could be true. He follows suit in line with his father. And there's a passage where he goes out to eat with Maureen and he's talking to her about how they were young and or yeah, how they were younger, and his dad would take him to lunch in the city. And at some point during one of the lunches, he looked at his father and he thinks to himself, "I hope to Christ I don't end up like you." And Frank is so apathetic and ambivalent toward his life's direction that he purposely chooses to do the work his father did, which is interesting. His indecision led him to a familiar path. Even though he was disgusted with his father. And I think that's because he just didn't choose any other avenue. when April's trying to sell him Paris and he says, "What if I'm I'm not they say big deal a lot." And it's very clear that Frank doesn't think much of himself. There's several passages where he says things like I was just so wise guy with a big mouth, and what if there isn't a true vocation for me, or yeah, if I had talent I could make something of my life, or you know. And at the end of the book, April kind of placates him and says, "You're obviously good at what you do, Frank." And Frank describes his job as not knowing what the hell he's doing. So he's good at doing what he doesn't know how to do. He's very good at winging it, at bullshitting, which is what I think a lot of the employees do. There's a very descriptive passage on, it's like Peter Gibbons. When Peter Gibbons says, in a given week, I probably only really do 15 minutes of actual real work. And Frank talks about letting the in basket fill up and shuffling papers and kicking the can down the road by sending a form through circulation, only for it to pass like twice, 3 times, 4 times again on his desk without ever really doing what it says. He just has zero ambition to be anything other than what he knows. And what he knows is what his father did. And so why should he? Why should he aspire to be anything more? I don't know that he can think above that mantle. I don't know that he believes in himself in any higher threshold. And when April later in the movie, I know the movie she says this, and I think this was important for Justin to put in. Frank is essentially content, with this life, even though he's not, but he doesn't know what else to do. All he knows, and this is from like the 50s mindset, is he's the man. He's got to be the provider. Everybody's depending on him. All that fucking pressure on the guy's shoulders. And he's got to do what he does. So he does, and he hates it, but what else is there to do? And any deviation from that is, I think, almost an insult. Even to say, even to suggest that, we don't have to live like this. You can do whatever you want to do. I think he could never understand that. Not because he is a dumb, insensitive husband. I don't think that's fair to put on that character. I think he just doesn't know what the fuck to do with his life. And before he can even decide, he's already met somebody, knocked her up, as they say in the sentence, gotten married, gotten a house. Like, he's already in so fucking deep before he can even begin to think about who the fuck he is and what he wants out of life. And personally, that's something that I was terrified of happening, but I had the luxury to think about that one and put it off. I think as I get older, I realize that these are very heavy things to think about. They're very important things to think about for every individual. And I think a lot of people do feel the pressure of being coupled up and still living this idealized American life. If you live in America, this idealized American dream, suburban life. Not everybody, but a lot of people, at the very least, they feel pressure to get coupled up and have kids. And so they cave into that pressure. It's like a legacy or something that they feel is their destiny before they can even debate about whether or not it is. Before they can even do that, they're already in it. and then you're thinking about it, but it's quote unquote too late, even though it doesn't have to be. But then if you go breaking everything up, you look like the bad guy because you're trying to figure out who you are in this life. And I think that's a theme throughout all of Richard's work are people, I've said it before, who are lost, which is an easy blank statement because everybody is. Everybody is trying to figure out who they are, why they're here, why they are, and what the point is. And I know I am, and I think that's why his work resonates with me so much. Even though they don't ever come to a real answer, nobody does. You have to figure out what it is that is going to bring you any kind of semblance of peace, not happiness, but some kind of peace that isn't going to be destructive, and that's very difficult. Let's see. But yeah, I'm at the part of the book where he's in a conference with a guy and he's trying to figure out a career path, and he takes the job at Knox as a kind of joke. And he takes it almost as a challenge. Like I could be different. I can be different from my dad. I used to look down on my dad, but I can be different. And it's like, no, dude, you work in the same building doing the same menial bullshit. And it's just in modern times and with different titles. And there's a passage that April says, "The sales what?" April inquired. "Promotion? I don't get it. What does that mean you're supposed to do?" Who the hell knows? They explained it to me for half an hour and I still don't know. I don't think they do either. So nobody knows what Knox is, but Knox Business Machines is essentially pretty much the center of their lives because that's how they make their living. And that's what they're living for. They're living for a business in which the the father of the family unit, the nuclear family, spends the majority of his time being good at something he doesn't know what he's doing and doesn't know how to do. And so it started as a kind of joke. And that line, it's talking about the job, but it almost, you could take it like, Frank's life. Like Frank's life is a joke. Others might fail to see the humor of it, but it filled Frank Wheeler with a secret, astringent delight as he discharged his lazy duties, walking around the office in a way that had lately become almost habitual. So Frank sees this job as a joke. Like I'm a legacy that didn't name drop my dad, and I can breeze through this and do just as good, if not better, than my dad. But it's a joke to me. And then slowly but surely it becomes not a joke. And then he's stuck there because he's knocked up the wife, because he has a mortgage, because he didn't do anything else. He didn't choose any other avenue. And joking about it with April is some form of connection in which they can bond over, even though she doesn't see it as funny. It's the joking about it is part of that superiority that ultimately bites him in the ass. That superiority complex in which you think you're better than everybody else, but you're just the same, and you've been had more than them because you thought you were better than them. You thought yourself as higher, so you have farther to fall because you're in deeper denial than they are. Um, these are themes that will always be uh, alive and prominent in society. Any society. It doesn't necessarily have to be an American society, but it is in this novel. I think Richard Yates was very much affected and afflicted by post war America. It must have been a trip to live through these times in which, and I heard this in in a documentary where people wanted things to be orderly and clean and crisp and nice because of the horrors of war, in which there was destruction and chaos and death. And that's understandable. But when everything is so rigid and so uptight, where if you deviate, you're essentially cast out or quickly gotten rid of and shoved away because you're garbage in this orderliness. It's it's no way to live because you're stripped of your individuality. And I don't think you can be. I was going to go off on a tangent about how I don't think you can be an individual in warfare, but I think you can and you can't. But I'm too ignorant on the subject, and I want to stick to the conformity of the 50s, and I think that's what he's getting at here. Even though they're getting drunk every day and going to work with hangovers, and so he talks about the Knox building and all the characters, and Jack Ordway, played by the great Dylan Baker in the movie, who's a chronic alcoholic. And Frank does just enough of a job to be noticed by higher ups. He goes just above half-assing it to make an impression, but not before he starts to dabble into an affair with a character named Maureen Grube. So I think the upset in his marriage with April, especially when she says something like, oh, let's see. When they have their fight, and I'm trying to find the line. I know the line from the movie, but I'm trying to stay away from the film, but she says, look at you. Look at you. How can you say by any stretch of the imagination that you can call yourself a man? Which is interesting because after this business with Maureen, in which he plots and plans to seduce her, I guess. Well, he does, essentially. Plots and plans to seduce her in just the right way that's quote unquote undetectable, even though there's a secretarial pool in which they're all having affairs. He's trying to salve the wound that has been inflicted on him, and he engages in an affair with this. She's a typist, and of course, taking advantage of her being younger. But he engages in the affair only to come home to April apologizing for the fights and how she's acted since the play. And afterwards, we're then shown to April trying to sell him the idea of moving to Paris, to Europe. And April, she prattles on and on, almost like Mrs. Givings, where they're almost going to make love because they're embracing, and she's apologizing, and she's like, no, I got to get this out. And I wanted to believe that this was genuine, where she's like, I want to apologize. I'm sorry how I've been since the play, and do you know what I did all day? I missed you. And the only way to stop her talking and get her out of sight was to kiss her mouth. And she rejects him because she's got to sell this idea. And I wanted to believe she was really sorry, but the implication is that she's patching up his ego that she wounded. And I didn't really think about it before, but she's working him just like Mrs. Givings was working them. I think you're terribly mean, she was saying. Terribly, terribly mean. Frank, did you like the presents? Was the tie all right? I mean, she won't shut the fuck up. She's like buttering him up, and he's like, what is this about? And even using kind of sex as a bargaining chip. And calling him pet name like darling, and she's pulling out all the stops for this one and he only realizes that later. And I do think she kind of turns it up a notch to get something she wants. And she kind of fucks up in the beginning of the cell when she says, it was when I first got pregnant with Jennifer and told you I was going to abort her. I mean, up until that moment, you didn't want a baby any more than I did. Why should you have? But when I went out and bought the rubber syringe, and I put the whole burden of the thing on you. It was like saying, all right, then, if you want this baby, it's going to be all your responsibility. You're going to have to turn yourself inside out to provide for us. You'll have to give up any idea of being anything in the world but a father. And this is kind of ludicrous because she presses it on all the way. If only you'd given me what I deserved. If only you called me a bitch and turned your back on me, you would have called my bluff in a minute. I'd probably never have gone through with the whole thing. And she talks about this role that she, quote unquote, feels that she forced on him to be a husband and a father. And it's like, no, it was an accident. And I've been making you live by it. I don't think I hesitate to say I don't think she believes in what she's saying. I think she's trying to sell her idea. The whole point of going to Europe, going to Paris, expatriation, is to escape the conformity, to escape the contamination. But they've already been contaminated. I don't know if you can become uncontaminated once you're affected. And he says things like, I think you're much too hard on yourself. Nothing's ever that black and white. You didn't force me to take the job at Knox. Besides, look at it this way. You say you've always known you weren't really an actress, and therefore it's not too legitimate for you to go walking around feeling cheated. Isn't it just possible the same thing applies to me? I mean, whoever said I was supposed to be a big deal? So he comes back at her with reality. Like I'm just I'm just a guy. I'm not anything more than what I have been. I could be. I don't know that he thinks this, but he could be something else if he wanted to be, but I don't know that he wants to be. I don't know that he knows he can want to be. And she keeps pushing and pushing and pushing, like the guy you used to look up to said, if I had half that guy's brains, I'd quit worrying about Frank. Whether or not that's true, who knows? But her final, like, clinching selling point is the very thing that she cut him deepest with at the beginning. And she says, after like probably an hour or two of like trying to sell him and failing, she says, "Don't you see what I'm saying? It's got nothing to do with definite measurable talents. It's your very essence that's being stifled here. It's what you are that's being denied and denied and denied in this kind of life. Don't you know? You're the most valuable and wonderful thing in the world. You're a man." And I think I don't know what to think. In the movie, they sell it as it's really coming from her heart. But in the book, it reads like she's pulling out. In the book, it feels like both. It feels genuine, but it also feels like she's pulling out the big guns to tip the scales in her favor. And the only reason I'm saying that is later on in the book, he questioned himself about whether or not she was being genuine. So Frank questioning himself makes me question my interpretation of it. I She's singing with her heart here because she sees an opportunity to extricate themselves from this dull hell they have to live every day. And the next sentence is, and of all the capitulations in his life, this was the one that seemed most like a victory. Nothing before had elation welled more powerfully inside him, never had beauty grown more purely out of truth. Never in taking his wife had he ever triumphed more completely over time and space. He had taken command of the universe because he was a man, and because the marvelous creature who opened and moved for him, tender and strong, was a woman. And I think that's also a part of the nuclear family, at least in the 50s, or we'll say post war America, is that the pinnacle of success of the American dream, aside from having the house paid off and the white picket fence, was to, and I could be wrong here because I'm not a guy, was to be a man's man and to be the husband, the provider, and find a woman who will join you in your journey and uh, support you by bearing your children. So if you can find a woman and knock her up and bring kids into the world, you're a success, essentially, because you've made the nuclear family. You're the American ideal. And by that definite or better definitions, probably, Frank is a success. He's got the job, he's got the house, he's got the wife, he's got the kids, and that's it. And so now you're telling me that's not it, and there's something more. But what's more? Moving to a country where we don't speak the language, we don't know the pinnacle of success, um a country that many people were there in wartime, and yeah, why not? I don't know. I don't think he was ever fully sold on it, but except for like possibly that moment where he felt so high and strong because she built him up that much. I think probably as a person, he had all the capabilities in the world as any sensible person that has enough brains to think sensibly. I could say it better, but I can't. Does, but the support, the added support from somebody else, especially his wife, who he chose to join him in this journey of life, is probably the one person that could put him as high as she did. He can't put himself as high as she did. She's the extra oomph that pushes him up. And it's like he almost needs that. But when the reality of the situation um, brings him back down and that reality is shattered, he sees that he's been had by her. Even though I think there's a big part of her that believes this plan can work, it can be real. But there's no guarantee that it will. And I was thinking about this earlier today. Her dream is to move overseas, sell the house and the car, and they've got enough money for like 6 to 9 months or whatever until she finds a job, and she can support him while he figures out who he is and what he wants to do in life, and can take a fucking break from being a lifer at Knox or any other any other um, job that's like that. And there are endless jobs like that seemingly in this setting. And she sells them on it in part one, at the end of part one. And the sad thing is, it reignites their marriage. Like I said, I think he believed in it for a very short amount of time, and it sparked a renaissance of romance between the two. And it's sad that it couldn't remain. But it sparked the romance because they were in the dream state. They were dreaming, and they were putting all their eggs into the basket of this hope, and they're living in the hopeless emptiness. The hopeless emptiness is what keeps them chained to the reality of their lives and who they are. And she's trying with everything she can to like free them of it. And since there's two of them, she has to expend that much energy to do it until she becomes pregnant. And then she's weighed down even more. It's devastating. Um, I'm at part two in the book as I'm flipping through the pages, kind of moving along. And I got to thinking about this today. I was in the car trying to think of like talking points because I didn't write anything down prior. When I was reading, I was thinking of things I wanted to talk about, and of course, I didn't put them down because this is just a ramble. It's not a serious synopsis. But I've seen and read many criticisms of this book where they say April is selfish. And I think they mean that to say she's selfish because of many different factors. She's selfish because she wanted an abortion, because people get very gatekeepy about having not having kids being selfish or abortion being selfish. And then people get gatekeepy about having kids as being selfish. I don't know, it's weird. I think people see her as selfish for having killed herself. Even I'm not sure if that's what she wanted to do, but I think she knew that was a very real possibility. And I think she might have wanted to do it. And when it was happening, she realized the seriousness of it. At least in the film, she has a little break where it's already happened and she can't undo it. Um, and the question is, do I think April is selfish? Or and another question would be, is she selfish to want to uproot the entire family to Paris from America? Expatriation. Do I think April Wheeler is selfish? Yes and no. That goes in line with the question, do I think April and Frank are bad people? I want to say no, just because they're contaminated. They've been had. And they're realizing it and trying to make sense of it and trying to pull themselves out of it. And it just further ruins their marriage and their lives until their ultimate demise. I think they're people being people, making good and bad choices. They both cheat on each other. That's horrible. That's inexcusable. And I was talking about how his cheating with Maureen was him trying to fulfill a wounded ego, which I think is usually the culprit of uh, cheating. But it's still inexcusable. But she also cheats on him with Shep. And the question is whether or not she willed that to happen, whether or not she wanted that to happen. And I don't know. I still don't know. It's very possible. But I'll talk about that when I get to that point in the book. And whether or not I still say they're bad people, I again, they're people being people. And I don't think they're bad. I think they're trying and failing to realize who they are and why they are. And their actions through that action leads to bad choices. So I don't know that it's fair to say that they're bad people, even though they do bad things. They do bad things to themselves and they do bad things to each other. Does that make them bad? No, I don't think so. I think I th- does that make them good? No, it doesn't make them good at all. I think they're trying, and trying doesn't necessarily mean good or bad. And maybe that's a scapegoat for this question, but I can't say that they're good or bad people. They're not golden people, quote unquote. They're invisible people. I think they might be invisible people trying to be golden people, but realizing that they'll never be the golden people. And they're trying to address it, if not accept it, in unacceptable circumstances. Having to admit defeat is defeating. Having to admit that this is who I am, and this is probably who I'm going to be from here on out. And if you're unhappy in it, is devastating. It's like a prison sentence. And it's no wonder anybody would feel trapped. You in the trap, you in the trap. Don't make me fucking laugh. Just because you got me safely in this they're both in the trap. They're both trapped. It's just whether or not they see it, whether or not they want to see it, and if they see it, if they'll ignore it or see it and then do something about it, like I said earlier. And if you have two people in the situation that have different opinions as to what to do or what not to do, or both or neither, that's where the conflict comes from. And this whole book is conflict. It's two people trying and failing in their try and realizing they're failing in their trying all the way down. But what else can you do? What else can you do? You either, and Kate Winslet says this in another book, in another film, actually, rather. I'm sure there's a passage in the book, but it's in Little Children where she's talking about Madame Bovary, and I haven't read. I think I tried to read it, and I was lost, so I need to go back to it. But she's talking about Madame Bovary and how you can choose to live a life of unhappiness or you can choose to struggle. And there's no winning on either in either choice, but you choose to struggle. Because if you choose to struggle, there's a chance, there's a very, very slight chance of something coming right from it. Something coming from nothing. We all came from nothing. We're the something that comes from the nothing. And our existence is proof positive that there is hope. I'm getting a little deep with this, but it's I feel it very strongly. And I'm probably reading too much into this, but that's the choice you have. You can choose to do nothing and be unhappy, or you can choose to struggle and still be unhappy, but still have a sliver of hope that you can be happy. That's why I think the pursuit of happiness is what's guaranteed, at least in this country. And the pursuit of happiness in America, even if your pursuit takes you elsewhere, you have a chance. Everybody has a chance. Just the chances of making it are very slim, but there's a chance. So, getting into part 2, where they're riding the high of the choice that they've made. They're riding the high that they're going, and it's the superiority complex. They're riding higher than normal. They are so high that they're just pushing themselves to higher heights. And anyone who doesn't understand is an idiot, or who is too contaminated, who is too bought and sold. They wouldn't get it. We know what we're doing. And it's not until the reality of the situation sets in where Frank starts to have doubts. And doubt is that little niggling thing, that little crumb disturbance, that little fleck of dirt in the orderliness that can fuck up everything, because it's saying that this fail-safe plan, this foolproof, fail-safe, heaven-like dream plan of yours, which is now ours, I find fault with it, and there's a chance it's not going to work. And that starts to drain the light of hope away, and it starts to dim it. And she's banking on this, counting on this to burn so bright, because this light is her life force. This hope is her life force. She's found new life in this light, and she needs it, and he's already finding fault with it. And it starts with, like, them fighting about what to pack, how, what books they buy to learn the language. The discourses they're having about the preparations for the trip are not that far removed from the discourses they have as a couple in the lives they're living now. Just because you have a fight and you apologize to someone, if you don't address what you're sorry for and address the situation, why it happened, what was the cause of it, how can we move forward without doing it again, it's going to still exist. It's always still going to exist. And it's going to be part of the thing that makes that doubt grow bigger and bigger. So the kids are arguing about things they want to take. They're having trouble with what language books to start out with. And then we move on to Shep and Millie. Because we see a couple that are not, again, not that far removed. They're the Campbells. And they're parallel to the Wheelers. They're another model family who have a mom and a dad and 4 sons that lie in front of the television and are transfixed by Howdy Doody and ignore their father when they ask the boys what they want. And they're people that are asking themselves the same question, but I think Shep more than Millie. I think Frank and Millie are more alike. Frank and Millie and Shep and April are more alike than Shep and Millie and Frank and April. Not that they're suited to be a couple, but just as people who live in the times they're living in and how they're following suit. Although I think Shep is more accepting of the fact that maybe the best is behind him, but he had it and it existed and he can deal with this now. I think Frank does too, but his life is more defined by what male figures higher up are deeming and gleaming onto him later on. Richard has a whole section of the book where he talks about the Campbells, specifically Shep Campbell, and how Shep found what he found in a wife in Millie, and he feels this allegiance with her, even though sometimes she smells rancid or he gets on her fucking nerves. She stood by him in a very important time in her life, and I think he feels like this unyielding loyalty to her, like a unyielding lifetime loyalty to her for having stood by him, even if he's repulsed by her and cheats on her. But like, she's the woman in his life that Frank was talking about concerning April. Let's see. Millie is to Shep in the way that she's a marvelous creature who opened and moved for him, tender and strong, was a woman at some point in their lives. And then I think he accepted that as fact, and then that was it. But now they live in the here and now where, he loves her, but most times he has to tolerate her. They're this couple in which there's an accepted love. It was strong at one point, but now it just is. And that's fine for the most part until, your neighbor April Wheeler stops by and until he's alone in the backyard fantasizing about her. And there's passages like, "I love you, April," he whispered, just to see what it felt like. "I love you, I love you." And it's like, It's a literally the grass is greener situation in which this patrician woman with too much weight around her head, or I forgot. There's a comment. Um, this book gets criticized for the way Richard writes women, which I don't disagree with. We talk about April, who's like I forget, like probably 35 or something, as matronly and she used to have the figure of maidenhood, which is it is a little cringy, but it's essentially saying she doesn't have the youthfulness anymore. And it's like, of course not. She's had two fucking kids. It's altered her body forever. But apparently, she's still attractive enough for Shep to fantasize about her. And I don't know that it's just lust. And this is something that I will forever be confused about. Do any of these characters really love each other? They love each other. Are they in love with each other? It's a very significant difference. Is Shep Campbell in love with Millie? Maybe he was at one time, and that's kind of receded to love, which isn't terrible, but it's concerning, but it can be enough to keep like in the back of a drawer because you have to keep up appearances. But when he's practicing whispering to himself, I love you, April, does he love April Wheeler? Or is he lusting after her? Even when they're having sex in a cramped Pontiac and he tells her to her face, I love you. And she kind of calls him out on it. It's like, don't say that. I'll get to that when I get to that. But it's just like, do you want to try on, somebody else's shoes and like see what it's really like? Do you really even know her? And that's part of it too, and a very important part of it. So they break the news to the Campbells that they're moving to Paris, and that kind of that rocks their whole world because they've established themselves as the people apart from the other people, the people who are superior to the other people. And now the Wheelers are establishing themselves as the superiors. You're better than us because you're moving away. I thought we were better than everyone. And they slide right back into the roles that they live. Shep says in the movie, Justin switches around some passages very, very well, I might add, that what kind of guy is going to sit around in his bathrobe picking his nose all day while the wife goes and supports him? And Millie freaks out like, I don't know who could do such a thing. I don't. And she has like a breakdown because like, how could that even be a thought? How could anybody be content with themselves to have the roles reversed while the woman supports the man? And it's a very I guess radical statement for the 50s. But when you have a model set up like the nuclear family where women can't even get a credit card without the permission of their husband or whatever, but I even think later on, I don't know, I'd have to read up more on that. But essentially, it's understood that the man is the one that goes out and earns a living. The woman stays at home and takes care of the kids in the house. That's how it is. That's how it's been determined. It's how it will be. And you're telling me you're going to go live with the frogs and be this, you're the radical ones who are going to flip-flop and what? It's immature and childish. But there's this look on both their faces. And even Frank says the look on their faces, where it's like, is it so childish? You're still supporting one another. And that's what marriage is supposed to be, more or less. You're supporting each other. If one person is in crisis, then the other person is supposed to help that person so the both of you can move ahead stronger. But is that person in a crisis, or is the other person the one in the crisis? Is the other one in the crisis makes the other one believe they're in a crisis so that the other one can get out of their crisis. So the next chapter is dedicated to Mrs. Givings and how she essentially, Mrs. Givings is the picture window. Mrs. Givings is the high point, selling point of kind of person in a community. If you don't see her as the pillar, she'll sell you that she is the pillar of the community, and here's why. And she'll tell you until you buy it, or until you want to break free and just concede and admit to yourself that you bought it. She is so relentlessly relentless in her in her the way she moves through life, in her constitution as a person, and in every engagement she has with any other person. Everything is picked at and picked apart and put together and commented on, and everything is noticed and arranged and assessed and stated. After all the babbling about it, it's stated as it is, or what it will be, or should be. And it's fucking exhausting. I've known people like this who will not shut the fuck up, who will not stop saying thank you for like the 10th time. It's it's just relentless. But let's see. So they talk about it's coming to a head where the Givings are going to essentially force John onto the Wheelers, but not before Frank breaks the news to Jack that they're moving. Because he has to tell somebody about what they're doing to hear how real it is, whether or not it's received well. And that brings him to talking to April about how conformed they were when they were starting out and how they still are, but that it's become so familiar and so comfortable that breaking the news of breaking away from that is making them incredibly uncomfortable. So, and it's bringing in the notion of Frank having to meet a higher up of Bandy named Bart Pollock. And I'm going to take a break real fast. I'll be right back. Or actually, yeah, I'll be right back. Okay. I don't like to take a break, but sometimes you can't help it. So, we're at the point of the book where the tensions to moving are rising and rising. And it's just at this time when the Givings finally bring John to the Wheelers. And just when things aren't tense enough, it becomes more tense for John to essentially evaluate them and then want to eviscerate them. Because I think that would amuse him, to spite his parents, specifically Mrs. Givings. Except that since the Wheelers upset Mrs. Givings first by their news of moving, I think he took great delight in that, and it won them over to him. Because they admit to him that they're living in the hopeless emptiness. The practical side of the Europe plan didn't seem to interest John Givings, but he was full of persistent questions about their reasons for going. And once, when Frank said something about the hopeless emptiness of everything in this country, he came to a stop on the grass and looked thunderstruck. "Wow," he said, "now you've said it, the hopeless emptiness. Hell, plenty of people are on to the emptiness part. Out where I used to work on the coast, that's all we ever talked about. Nobody ever said hopeless." So the one person that identifies with them is the one that's uh, institutionalized. And that begs the question, are all these sane people insane? If the insane people have sensible statements, or is the insane sane for not, or is the insane for not committing to the conformity? Because the two people that are deemed mentally unwell in this book are John Givings and April Wheeler by the end of it. So the Wheelers win over John, and Mrs. Givings kind of sits back and watches in gratitude. And then we're led on to raising the stakes. And I think this part was very well executed. Because if Frank ever had any doubt in moving to Paris, any speck of a dirt of doubt, Bart Pollock helped him add the dirt to the scale with his proposition and inflating the ego. This is another instance in which a character is buttering up another character to get what they want. Bart Pollock wants Frank Wheeler as part of his new company because he liked Frank Wheeler's little one-off of speaking of inventory control. Knowing what you've got, comma, knowing what you can do without. Or what is it? Knowing what you've got, comma, knowing what you need, comma, knowing what you can do without, dash. That's inventory control. So Bart Pollock talks to Frank about Frank's life, about his life, and Frank kind of lets on that he's might be making changes in his life, but he's not going into specifics, and he might be leaving the company. And Bart says, "Oh, another outfit," and Frank will not admit, "My wife had the idea of moving abroad and I'm following her. He cannot admit to himself that this is essentially April's idea, and that April had pitched this to him and sold it to him, and he's going along with it. But now, this big man, big deal, is making a new pitch in which the place that he's been pulling out of and is now being drawn further in is now willing to compensate him for any distress that's happening domestically. It was going to be the proposition anyway, but he's got to sell it harder because of Frank's confession of possibly, I was going to say resigning, but leaving is probably the more appropriate term. He's leaving to go somewhere else. He won't admit that he's leaving the country, but he's under the impression that he's leaving for something better, and he lets Bart gnaw on the possibility of leaving for a better company, which is smart move. So Bart tries to sell on the information he's given, and the fact that Frank admits to Bart that my dad used to work there was the one personal nugget that Bart used against him. Usually when people confide something in you and they use it against you, it comes at a later date, but this happens in the same conversation. Not only is he aware that his father has passed and he's aware that he worked for Knox, but he used that to say, but Frank, in all sincerity, if you do decide for Knox, I'll believe it'll be a thing you'll never regret. I believe it'd be a fine memorial and tribute to your dad. It's like a knife in the gut, because it's like, I hope to Christ I don't end up like you, but it's like, I am a legacy. This is who I am. This is who I was meant to be. I have somebody else telling me this is what I have to do to honor you. To honor my father, I have a real chance at that. And my other choice is to be this subordinate to my wife, this sissy who's gonna sit at home and fuck around. No, I need to be a man's man. I need to grow up and be a man. I have a man telling, and I don't want to make it sexist, but I feel there's truth to this. I have a man telling me that the other man in my life is important, and this is what I can do to honor him. It's a no-brainer. I'm going to choose that choice instead of my wife's choice. I'm going to tell her that it's just an option, but deep down I already know I have chosen. So at this point in the book, the proposition has been made, and the stress is so high from the planning and the plotting of everything they have to do to move. And she finds out, and she finally confesses to him that she's pregnant. And she's so upset at it. She says, "Nothing happened today that I haven't known about for days and days. And oh God, Frank, please don't look so dense. Do you really mean you haven't known it too, or guessed it, or anything? I'm pregnant, that's all." And so this is raising the stakes. This is I think they both know at this point that this is the thing that's killed the dream. Why it isn't feasible to go with 3 kids instead of 2, and that's what John Givings will say, I don't know, but they'll use it as an excuse, or at least one will use it as an excuse to tip the scale to use against the other. And when he finds out she has a rubber syringe to perform a self abortion, I feel like he takes that as another slight. I mean, he states it, it's another slight against his ego. This is a thing that you've unilaterally decided, a thing that concerns both of us. You've unilaterally decided through the action of buying this syringe that you're going to do to go on with your plan of moving. And she says at the end of part 2, and what do you think you're going to do? Do you think you're going to stop me? And I think it's important to note the conversation again of, is April selfish? Is April a bad person? I think both the characters in this book are trying to come to terms again with who they are, why they're here, and what the point is. And they already know their roles in their life. These roles are defined. They are husband and father, wife and mother, Knox businessman, revolutionary estate homemaker. But the more and more titles are put on a person, the more and more the individuality is stripped away. And I think in April's case, all she's trying to do is climb out of that hole. She's trying to find out who she is. And I think I was talking about it earlier. I think she wants a vocation where she can do something to where she can contribute to her family. But again, there's no saying any of that could work out. They could move abroad and she could have the man's burden on her, the quote unquote man's burden on her back, and then feel resentful for having to support everybody while Frank, quote unquote, sits in his underwear picking his nose all day. That could have happened, but she's holding on to the dream that it'll be their way out. And in the movie, she says this is our one chance. She's pinning all her hopes onto this proposition that has no chance, or has no guarantee rather, of succeeding. But she's determined and decided that it will succeed. And because she's decided it, and so it will be. Because she needs it to be. So, yeah, at the end of part 2, tensions are high and she's pregnant. And then we move on. Let's see. He starts part 3 with this tract about how somebody is operating in wartime. And that comes in later with Shep trying to assess and execute how his mission of handling April's death will go to all the other characters. There's a crisis, it has to be assessed and evaluated, and the actions of dealing with it carried out. And at the end of this passage, in the beginning of part 3, it says, he has brought order out of chaos. And that goes back to something out of nothing. But this is almost the reverse. This is nothing out of something. You have two characters that are running towards polar opposite possibilities of existence, and yet they're tied together. You have one character that's trying to I guess from this passage, they're trying to get to the nothing out of all this chaos, out of all this something. They're trying to get to some semblance of peace, which can be a bland, conformed, orderly, well traveled existence. And then you have this other character that is trying to, with everything she has, to break free. And she's just being weighted and weighted and weighted down at every turn. She's trying to make something out of the nothing, and she's failing and failing and failing and falling and falling and falling. And so they talk about the conception of the third child. And I find this interesting because he's the one that says it feels sort of loose. And he's talking about her diaphragm. She's the one that had the contraception, because that's usually what happens. Aside from condoms, the woman is not only responsible for the contraception, but in having whatever it is the contraception is, but applying it as well. I find it interesting that Richard talks about Frank being concerned at being loose. And she's the one that says, oh, no, 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 everything's fine. Don't stop, don't stop. Because they're in the heat of the moment, obviously. But she's the one that keeps going. Usually, you hear of the other way around. But, so the question is it her fault that she's pregnant because they didn't stop and check to make sure the diaphragm fit? Well, no, not necessarily. And yes, necessarily. Uh, she could have been, anything could have happened before the fact. Like, anything could have traversed past the diagram, if they stopped and reinserted it. Um, or it didn't necessarily, although they do say they were able to fix their date of conception in the latter part of the first week in May, the week after his birthday, when they could both remember his whispering. It feels okay. So it was that coitus. It was that sex session where she was basically impregnated, but through quote unquote faulty contraception. And I was driving around thinking about this today. The character Jack Ordway says, foiled by faulty contraception. Okay. The question is, was the contraception faulty? And it's like, okay, she had bought a new diaphragm the following week just to be sure. And this, okay. So it's like, no, it's a new one, but did she practice with it? Did she make sure it fit right? Did they, read the instructions? Was it a lemon of a contraception, or did she just fail to use it properly? So could the fault be then placed on April when she's trying to do damage control by buying a rubber syringe behind his back and possibly even perform an abortion behind his back? Is she the one at fault for the whole mess? And it's like, well, no, it takes two to tango. But I do find it interesting that he could have said nothing and just kept going, but he did say it feels sort of loose. And she's the one that might have made a mistake. The contraception might have been fine, it just might have not have been inserted properly. And she might not have known how to insert it properly. She might have thought she inserted it properly, and when it was happening, it wasn't. And that's how accidents happen. But this accident affected their lives in a devastating way. So it's at this part of the book when they're talking about abortion. And it's a very, very heavy topic, and it always will be. And I'm not victim blaming. Oh, God, I hate even like talking about this because I'm not saying it was necessarily her fault. And I'm not saying like it's the contraception's fault or that it's faulty. It could be, it could not be, it could be inserted improperly. You know, something went wrong during the conception of this baby, and she wound up pregnant, and it is wrecking their entire plans. And now she's thinking practically about how this quote unquote instance or mistake is affecting their lives, how it will affect their lives and their plans. Unknowingly ignorant of the fact that Frank has basically decided that he's not moving and he's going to take this promotion with Bart Pollock. And this pregnancy is and or could be a clinching factor in them deciding to stay. And this book, I haven't really read on whether or not people see this as like a pro-abortion or anti-abortion or pro-choice or anti-abortion book or a feminist book, or people seem to hate April. I don't. And I don't think of this book in that sense. I think clearly abortion is a big part of this book. I think it's definitely part of the determining factor of the breakdown of their marriage. Their whole marriage has been about building and building and building, which any normal, typical marriage would or could or should be. But this building and building and building has been on the pretense of what the model American family is or should be. When you grow up and become an adult, you go to school, you get a degree, you get a job, you meet a girl, you buy a house, or you get pregnant, you buy a house, and and it's building and building and building. You follow the formula, you make the life, you build the life, and there you have it. But this building and building and building has been pressure and pressure and pressure on both their backs, because I don't think this is the lives they intended for themselves to live, and they didn't know it until it was too late. But now they're in it, and they have to decide whether or not to continue to follow this path. And again, I think Frank is all in and committed to, well, this is how it is, and this is how it's going to be. And April is drowning, and having become pregnant with a third baby, is her head is underwater at this point, and she's every now and then she's coming up for air, but she's being weighted and weighted and weighted down. And they're fighting about the fact that And this is a very important part of the movie where she's finally realizing that he's more or less decided. She's like, "You don't want to go, do you?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, of course I do, but this new job that's opening, it could make things different. It could change the lives of all of us." And she goes back to her original selling points of, "Wouldn't you be still be miserable doing something you hated?" And he they both have to be ready to fight and have their points, and they both know that, like, they have opposing viewpoints, and there is no winning in a situation like this, but there has to be some kind of an outcome. They're both in so deep, there has to be some kind of outcome, and there will be, but they both don't know what it is. But clearly there's going to be a winner and a loser, yet there is no winning. Everything about this says like they're going to lose, and they're both going to be losers, and it's going to be awful. So she's trying to sell him now of not having to have this child. And yeah, I'm going to still be doing what I hate. Um having to be doing what I hate, especially now since we're going to have this third kid, but suppose we let that be my business. And how much, he would ask her, would his prime of manhood be worth if it had to be made conditional on allowing her to commit a criminal mutilation of herself? So, and this is rich, because that's what you'd be doing, April. There's no getting around it. You'd be committing a crime against your own substance and mine. So he has to sell her first that you're mutilating your body and, something of your own creation. And it's like you, and me. So he has to, like, dig it into her in a different way that she's like afflicting herself, mutilating herself, and a part of him now that, a part of him is in her. You're killing a part of yourself and myself. For me, no, that makes me disgusting. It makes me sick to even think about it. And as if she didn't feel trapped or caged in, this just pushes her more and more and more and more and more back into a corner to where she's gonna fucking lose it. Anybody would lose it. And it's like, so you're saying I have this thing in me, this thing that is gonna be the determinant of the rest of our lives, and I can't get rid of it because it somehow insults your manhood or something? Your cum or your whatever sperm, because it hit my egg and made an embryo, is an insult to your manhood or something? So then they break the news to everybody that they're not going because April got knocked up. And let's see. And they have the final fight. There's got to be a final determining fight where they make a decision. Do I stay or do I go? Do we stay or do we go? And she's pulling out all the stops and saying, like, let's say, he's using her childhood and her parents' negligence against her, or her parents' negligence, the knowledge of her childhood against her, saying that she's emotionally disturbed because she wants to have an abortion. And he's trying to flip it and sell it. I mean, it's always been a wonder to me that you could survive a childhood like that. let alone come out of it without any damage to your, your ego and everything. So it's all about ego. How can you fluff up or cut down somebody else's ego? So, and her thinking irrationally about abortion is uh, the thinking of a disturbed person, and that's clearly a result from a neglected childhood or something. And then she says, "But I've had 2 children. Doesn't that count in my favor?" Using the kids as bargaining chips. And he said, "The very fact that you put it that way is kind of significant." So they're using these real life statements about things that have happened in their individual lives and their married lives. They're using them as like almost talking points in a debate to to build their case and sell their case as to why they should stay or go. And they're using their words for and against each other. And he finally essentially says, "You don't seem to be entirely rational about this thing. I just wish you'd think about it a little." And it's like, if you need help, it will be paid for. And essentially at some point she has to concede that he's already decided, "I'm already pregnant, and everything's already been decided for me. And this is not going to happen." And the dream, the hope just gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. And therefore her life force gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. And the very fact that she's pregnant, that's also sucking away her life force. It's adding more weight to her. She has to wear old maternity dress, these drab like garb, this drab garb of a dress. Her individuality. She's not April, she's mom. And she's more mom than she'll ever be April. And that in itself is a death. And the walls are closing in. And then just when things get so dire, they have another visit from John Givings, who, when he learns that, let's see, I'm trying to say it because it's not this instance that they're talking about. They confess that she's pregnant, but they confess to the kids that they're not going. Let's see. And they're having to sit in their decision of not going and how it affects them. And Frank is having to accept the fact that whether or not he's a Knox man, he's going to be a guy in his cubicle, in a cubicle, the rest of his life. And is this who he really wants to be? And did he even want a third child in the first place? Did he even want the first 2 in the first place? Or did he even want to marry April in the first place? He has to ask himself all these questions because this is what he fought for and he won. And now it's like, do you really want this? It's okay to admit that you didn't want to go to Paris and you didn't want to go through with your wife's idea, and that wasn't for you. That's okay to admit, but is this what you wanted? Because this is what you were fighting for, and you got it. You got what you wanted, but did you want it? So they're at this crucial point in the story where they finally get together with Shep and Millie, and they admit to them that they're not going, April's kind of a walking zombie at this point, and she's going through the formalities and the niceties, and but up to a point, you can tell at some point she's like, "Oh fuck it, just do this and do that, and everything will be fine." And this is an important point in the film as well, and I'm glad they included this, where they meet at Vito's log cabin, and Shep and April have an affair, and I think it's important to note that the very nature of having an affair is something that's supposed to be titillating and kind of exhilarating, some kind of a life force. It's some kind of uh, lift. Clearly, it's sex, and it's supposed to be a kind of ecstasy. And I think April has this kind of fuck it attitude, and this guy is lusting off after me. I'm gonna play into it, and I'm gonna make. And not that she's gonna make him wait for it, but you know, the way he's talking, the way he's behaving towards me, the way he's positioning himself in the booth, everything, the way his body language is. I think she picks up on it, and they're dancing, they're touching, they're sweating, they're moving their bodies around each other, and then soon enough they're kissing, and then they're having sex in a cramped car, and and hearing it from his perspective that he's finally getting it. He's finally getting what he wants. I don't think he just wants sex from her. I think there is a big part of him that loves her, but it's what she says at the end of the chapter that's very real, where he's like, "I love you, I love you, I love you," and she's like, don't say that." And he says, "But it's true. I've always loved you. I'm not just being." And she says, "Just be quiet for a minute, and then you can take me home." So, and I think there's truth to what he's saying. He said it after they had sex, and maybe I'm naive, but you know, sometimes people will say whatever and do whatever they can to get somebody to fuck, but they fucked, and he still like is like hanging on to her, saying, "I love you," and then he has to say the things that anyone would say. "I guess you must think I'm kind of an idiot or something." And she says, "It's not that." She says, "It's not that, honestly. It's just that I don't know who you are." And that's even worse. And he's saying, "Don't talk riddles." And he's so embarrassed because he feels so rejected, even though they consummated their affair. That's why I think when he said he loves her, there's a huge part of it that's real, but I don't know that it's in love. I think he has love for her, but it didn't get a chance to develop because Frank got to her first, essentially. Even though I'm not convinced he's in love with her either. Um, how could anybody? Because she says, "I don't know who you are, and even if I did, I'm afraid it wouldn't help because you see, I don't know who I am either." And I think ending the chapter on that point is very important. And it's getting to the bottom of the whole debate about if you love somebody and you tell somebody you love them, that can be very real. But if you're to move forward, the real question is, are you in love with them? And if you're in love with someone, what does that mean? And what does that mean to you and to the other person? And if you know who the other person is, you know they've exposed themselves to you, all their vulnerabilities, um, both who they are as a person, their body, their life, their faults, their weaknesses, every embarrassing thing they can think of, um, and you fall in love with them, you love them completely. And I think Shep does love her, but he's not in love with her because of why she says. Like, you you don't know who I am. You've created this image of me, this like sexy, unattainable patrician neighbor, and you practice saying you love me in your yard without knowing what I do day to day and who I am. I don't even know who the fuck I am. So how the hell can you love me if you don't even know me? And it's at this point in the novel where it's starting to feel like she's a ghost. She's a ghost even now because she's part of the invisible people. She she does open up to Shep, and I think this is very important. She talks about the golden people. So let's see. I had this idea that there was a whole world of marvelous golden people somewhere. People who knew everything instinctively, who made their lives work out the way they wanted without even trying, who never had to make the best of a bad job because it never occurred to them to do anything less than perfectly fine the first time. Sort of heroic super people. All of them beautiful and witty and calm and kind, and I always imagined that when I did find them, I'd suddenly know that I belonged among them, that I was one of them, that I'd been meant to be one of them all along. And everything in the meantime had been a mistake. And they'd know it too. I'd be like the ugly duckling among the swans. I think that one confession to Shep is kind of what clinched his love for her, because I don't think she had ever confessed that to Frank, because if she had, she would then have to admit that she wasn't one of the golden people with him, right? She had sacrificed her chance at being one of the golden people to be one of the quote unquote invisible people, or I'll say not golden people, when all she ever wanted to be was one of the golden people. And knowing that she never was, or was never meant to be, again, is like a death. She finally has to admit that her dream is a dream. And the reality is that she's not really anything. As a person, of course she is. But in the role that she's living, in the life she's leading, she can't be herself. I don't think anybody can ever really be themselves in a kind of structure like that, where every day it's demanded of you to go to a job, provide for your family. We need you to be the dad. We need you to be the mom to survive. This is why you brought us here. Uh, Concerning kids. And I do think when John Giving says later, I bet you knocked her up on purpose just so you wouldn't have to find out what you're really made of. I do think people used to have kids to fulfill a destiny they thought they had to until they realized they didn't, but they then had to live out that responsibility of being the person that would have to be the provider, and that was their destiny. And it was so spelled out clearly for them that they didn't have to do any thinking about what they were actually meant to do, and if that was even a thing. Um, then there's a section of the book where he's talking about ending the affair with Maureen, and he's confronted by her roommate who breaks it down for him, and then he breaks her down and then feels bad about it, and then he breaks Maureen down and feels bad about that. So then I was driving around thinking about this today. Then, because he's ended his affair with Maureen, he has to now fulfill the place in life that he fought for, like I was talking about earlier. He fought to stay here, be a father, and be a husband. And there's passages in the book where he's realized this and he stepped it up. He stepped it up as a quote unquote man, and to be the provider, to be the father, to be the husband, to be the man's man. And he's turned the dial up and he's stepped it up and he's doing the thing he needs to do. And part of that is admitting to his wife that he had an affair. And in admitting he had an affair, he almost comes at it like wanting to fight. He wants to spar with his wife, as if to say, we've made the choice. What the fuck is your problem? Why are you still bitching about, not going? We're gonna be all right. I told you everything's gonna be all right. You said you hope so. You really hope so. I stepped up. I'm making sure everything's all right. Why the hell aren't you taking notice? And he says, and he admits that I've been with a girl in the city a few times, a girl I hardly even know. Yeah, my fucking coworker. I think the main thing was simply a case of feeling that my masculinity had been threatened somehow by all that abortion business. So he rubs it in that his ego was struck by abortion, which is a whole other thing entirely. Essentially saying I was fucking around because you were fucking around with me. You were going to go behind my back and do this thing without talking to me about it. So I went behind your back and did whatever the hell I wanted to do. I think that's kind of where this is going. Wanting to prove something. It's over now. It's really over. And if I weren't sure of that, I guess I could have never brought myself to tell you about it. So then she comes back with, why did you? As if to say, why did you have the affair? He takes it as that, and he says, baby, I don't know, I've tried to explain it to you, I'm still trying to explain it to myself. That's what I meant, it's being this neurotic, irrational thing. And she says, no, I don't mean why did you have the girl, I mean, why did you tell me about it? And that kind of blows his brain. What's the point? Is it supposed to make me jealous or something? Is it supposed to make me fall in love with you or back into bed with you or what? I mean, what am I supposed to say? And it is kind of like, did you tell her because you want her to see that he's being the upstanding man? Not that having an affair is upstanding, but that he told you about it. He could have never told you about it. But he did. He's being honest and forthcoming. And if we're going to do this thing, if we're going to have a fresh start, we want everything above board. And then she hits him with, well, why did you tell me about it? I don't give a fuck. And it's like, and he's like, okay. And this is the fight, the sparring has already started. What am I supposed to say, Frank? Why don't you say what you feel? I don't feel anything. And in the movie, Sam and Justin kick it up a notch. They have Leonardo say, in other words, you don't care what I do or who I fuck or anything, right? And in the book, it says who I go to bed with. But they want to kick it up a notch because this is when the movie really starts to kick off because it's just been fights, but now it's like we're getting into battle. And it's more than sparring. We're getting into battle. You've We've had to choose the choice, and now we've chosen, and now this is what it is. And we're gonna either live with it or die with it. And since, quote unquote, you've made me choose this choice, I'm still gonna struggle against it because I'm still alive. I'm not gonna have you make me be one of the dead, like invisible people. She's still struggling against it, even though there's this self-protection of her kind of being a zombie. She's still alive, but like it's slipping very fast. And in the film, she says to his, "You don't care who I fuck or anything," and she says, "No, I guess it's right. I don't. Fuck who you like." And he's like, "I want you to care." And they both know that he does. He wants her to care, and not that he wants her to care about the affair. He wants her to care about the conclusion of the choice. We've made the choice, not just me. We've, because we're married, we've made the choice to stay here. And I said it's going to be okay. Let it be my business. I'm going to make everything okay. And I want you to care about that. I want you to care and back me up and be the wife I knew you always have been and always would be. So what does she do? She comes back at it with, I know you do. And I suppose I would if I loved you. But you see, I don't. I don't love you. And I never really have. And I never really figured it out until this week. And that's why I'd just as soon not do any talking right now. And I still don't know if she never really loved him. The book and the movie strongly, strongly imply that she didn't. She didn't love him. I think she thought she did. I think she really, really liked him when they met. And when she said, I think you're the most interesting person I've ever met, a part of her really believed it, as much as she believed in the dream of going to Paris. But she had to realize that dream was just, that's all it was ever going to be, was just a dream. So the dream of their whole life as man and wife, as a marriage, as a couple, as a team, it's not a team. They're not a team. Somebody has to make a rational, sensible decision about the rest of the course of their lives. And it was Frank. And there's a passage in the book where he says he was the winner, but he won, but he didn't feel like the winner because there is no winners in this situation. There's only losing and losers. I think she loved him, but I don't know that she was ever in love with him. Because again, how could she be? Because she didn't allow him to see who she was, and I don't know that she ever really knew who he was. So they had this kind of surface level love agreement. that they lived on until the breaking point, until they couldn't live like that anymore, until she couldn't live like that anymore. I think he could live like that until he died, but she couldn't live like that anymore. And I think that's why some people deem her as selfish. Couldn't she just go on living that lie? Why did she have to kill herself, that selfish bitch? And it's like, no, they're living a lie. And there's an argument in the movie where she says the only reason we moved out here was because I got pregnant. And then we had another child just to prove that one, the first one wasn't a mistake. How long does it go on? And that line, how long does it go on? I think Justin wrote that, if I'm not mistaken. I'll feel terrible if Richard did. How long does it go on? How long do you perpetuate this cycle before somebody is wise enough and has the luxury of choosing not to choose that choice of perpetuating this miserable fucking existence? And so then and only then do they have that defining visit with John where John calls them out. He calls them both out. It's not that April wins because she says, I don't love you. I never really did. They both lost and they're both losers in this instance because because they were still denying that they were living a lie. April was coming out of it, but they were still living it in that moment. And John basically tells them, you guys are full of shit, and it wouldn't surprise me if you impregnated her on purpose, even though I don't think Frank did, to be fair to Frank. And so you wouldn't see what you're made of. And April, you give him a hard time, but, if making babies is the only way he can prove he's got a pair of balls. Because it's like you could have aborted it behind his back and never told him. But then that would be awful. But he says, you know what I'm glad of? I'm glad I'm not going to be that kid that April's pregnant with. And it was just today that I read a comment on YouTube under, I think, this scene from the movie, and somebody makes a very wise observation. When John Giving says, you know what I'm glad of? I'm glad I'm not going to be that kid. John is that kid. And I think they're right. John, and that didn't come from me, that came from a commenter on YouTube. John already is that kid. Mr. and Mrs. Givings are polar opposites. She is the motor mouth. She won't shut the fuck up. She's relentless. And not that they're modeled after Frank and April, but they're total opposites. And Howard is the peacekeeper. He's docile. He's kind of subservient to her. And they have this agreed upon surface level situated accepted love. There are people that married and had a family because that's what you do. And out of that construct, they had a kid and he ended up insane. Maybe that was from years, generations of this foolishness going on, or maybe the kid just ended up fucked up, or maybe this kid is this sane person living in an insane world. I think that was another YouTube comment, not mine. But I think that was a very astute, wise observation. John is that kid. He's that kid that is the product of this insanity. And he's actually, quote unquote, insane and needs to be institutionalized. So then, after the Givingses leave, after the upset and Mrs. Givings being humiliated from her son, Frank and April have another fight. It's basically the last fight they ever have. It's supposed to be, I think, the worst one they will ever have. The one where they first had a stranger tell them what the deal was, and now they're telling themselves what the deal is. So, as a preamble to this fight, I said I don't love you, and now we have a man that came in here and told us what the deal is. We're both full of shit, and here's how we're full of shit. Um, he says, don't tell me, let me guess. I made a disgusting spectacle of myself, and everything that man said is true, right? Isn't that what you're going to say? And she says, apparently I don't have to. You're saying it for me. And he says, don't you see how wrong it is? And she said, no, why is it wrong? And he says, because the man is insane. So, a guy that tells the truth about a situation that he has no business telling anybody the truth of because it's not his business, um, kind of puts people in his place in their own home is insane. Frank reiterates, the man is insane. Do you know what the definition of insanity is? And she says, no, do you? And he says, yes, it's the inability to relate to another human being. It's the inability to love. And this is the point in the book and the film that I struggled with and still struggle with, but I'm only now, since I'm talking it out, I'm kind of trying to get my head around it. So, like I said, the preamble to this fight was that she said, I don't love you. So then after they have the visit and the breakdown, and he comes up with this inane definition of insanity, it's the inability to relate to another human being. It's the inability to love. And she laughs at him, and if black could be made into can't talk. If black could be made into white by talking, you'd be the man for the job. So now I'm crazy because I don't love you, right? And he says, no, wrong. You're not crazy, and you do love me. That's the point. And again, she says, but I don't. In fact, I loathe the sight of you. In fact, if you come any closer, if you touch me or anything, I think I'll scream. And so she screams in his face after he touches her, and it's only then does Frank release his hurt. Because how else are you supposed to feel when somebody you thought loved you tells you that they don't love you, that they never loved you? How awful would that be if you entered into a marriage with someone, had kids with them, made a house, a home with them, and they said, oh, I never really loved you. And he says, you're an empty, hollow fucking shell of a woman. And Leo, like, gives the performance of a lifetime of the scene where he says, what the hell are you living in my house for if you hate me so much? What the hell are you married? Why the hell did you marry me? Why the hell are you carrying my child for? And so he strikes at her. It's all about striking at each other. The hardest word will hurt the most. Why the hell didn't you get rid of it when you had the chance? Because listen to me. I wish to God you'd done it. So the thing that is it was a thing that was his and her essence when it was working for him. But now that it's working against him, it's it. It's an it. It's not even a product of them. It's it. It's the thing that's like the linchpin of their coming apart, which doesn't really make sense. It's like an oxymoron. But it's the pin in the grenade, essentially. And her giving herself uh a, a I don't even know how you call it, a late term self abortion is pulling the pin. She's gonna blow, and he says, you're not worth the powder it'd take to blow you up. And I think she's like, fine, fuck it, I'll do it myself. And they have their big fight, and she leaves the house and he's petrified because he could hear her slam the back door, and it's not a dream, it's real. She's leaving him. And in the film, they like to say fuck a lot to emphasize their point. And I I like that. I buy it. But in the book, she says, "Can I even get away from you in the woods?" In the film, Kate says, "Can I even get away from you in the fucking woods?" Like fucking is used to emphasize the barbs and the stings. But it's not needed in the book. Because I think the next lines, "Do you want me to scream again, Frank? Because I will. If you say another word, I mean it." I think that is more impactful than any like fucking emphasis is. She's saying, "Leave me alone. Leave me alone." And she said this in the beginning of the book when he's trying to, like, again, fix a situation that cannot be fixed. It cannot be fixed. He keeps meddling and meddling and meddling and trying and trying and trying to put back this mural, this tapestry, this picture perfect window that's broken. It's broken. It's done. It's fucked. It's unfixable. And she's like, "Stop, stop, stop. Leave me alone. Stop. Just stop." And it's like, you telling me to stop trying to fix this. You're telling me that whatever this is that we had isn't. And I can't accept that. I have to try to fix it. You're my wife. I married you. I love you. And that's part of what I am and who I am, and what I try to do is fix everything and make it better. And it's like, you can't make this better. It never was okay to begin with. We were on this track that we didn't know what we were getting into until we were into it, and it's too late. So then the rest of the book is him hiding in the house, watching her, trying to read her while she's pacing around outside until she comes back to the house, and he dreams that she approached him in his sleep until the next morning. They have this tense breakfast, and he talks about entering the kitchen, and he doesn't know what this is. Whatever this game is, I'll have to play it because I don't know where I stand with her. I don't know what this is. I don't know what to do, except I have to move forward. And she's making pretend that everything's okay. We both know it isn't, but I'm gonna try and face it. So they have the nuclear coffee with the nuclear eggs, and they have the conversation that she encourages him to have, because everything about this is the model wife. This is what we've chosen instead of Paris. We've chosen to sit here and have our eggs and coffee and talk about you, Frank Wheeler, the Bart Pollock associate man, the big man who got the promotion because you are a big deal and this was your true calling. So tell me about your job. You're going to tell me about this machine that you're a part of it coming to fruition, and you're illustrating it for me. And she says, "Oh, I see. At least I think I see." It really is sort of interesting, isn't it? You should value what you do, Frank. You're obviously good at it. And so they're both playing the roles. And they're both speaking steadily and calmly and saying their role lines as if they're not as if they're rehearsing for the petrified forest. They're living in the petrified forest. They're living the play of what their lives are supposed to be in the picture window. And they're saying please and thank you. And part of that is them keeping it together until he can't. And he says, then you don't really hate me or anything. And she says, no. And they have their niceties until they part. And they never see each other again. And so April keeps it together. She keeps it together. She keeps it together until she doesn't. And she's left alone. And the house is like a tomb at this point, and all she's doing is providing the preparation for the act she's decided she's going to carry out, because that act is her decision, her final choice over a decision in her life. The act of self-aborting is the last kind of agency she has over her life. If everything else is decided, if everything else, every movement I make, every thing I do, if you're going to make me be the wife and make the food and bring you your briefcase and call you honey and prop you up, I want to have a say over what I do with my body. And I hesitate to say that because this is what ends up happening is a tragedy. And whenever something like this happens, of course, it should be a mutual decision unless the situation is untenable or there's something messed up about it. But I think her choice to self-abort late term, knowing that there's a possibility of her not having or not being able to survive it, is a choice of agency. It is a choice of euthanasia, even though it's forced her hand to kill another being in the process. But I don't think she can let herself go there, because to her, even though this was the breakdown of their marriage, this is the how do I say this? This is the thing that's going to allow me to get the last kind of freedom I'm allowed to have, and that's death. And maybe I'm reaching with that, but the choice I feel like the choice that's used against me, I'm going to use it to my advantage. And that's a very dark thing to say, and I could be entirely wrong about that, but I don't think I'm entirely wrong about it, because it's the only card she has to play. She's already broken. She's already lost. She's already a loser. And what's the point in living a life that others are going to live? Others have already lived and will live in suit. What's the point of my even being here? I've already been erased. I'm already erased. I'm never going to be one of the golden people. There's no point in me being here. So, in the last parts of the book, it's Millie finding out what's happened, and Shep taking command and telling Frank, and the Campbells trying to take care of Frank before they realized that Frank has to react how he's going to react. And Shep is spiraling, thinking, was I the cause of this? I don't know if he thinks he impregnated her. I don't know if he thinks him having an affair affected her. Something to where he learns that Frank thinks he killed herself, makes him think he was part of that decision, even though he wasn't at all. And then Frank finally has to come to the realization that she did it to herself. She killed herself. And she would have done it last month, and I talked her out of it. It would have been safe then. And she was so damn nice this morning. But yeah, she was nice because she was playing the role that she had to play. Because if she wouldn't have played the role, he would have looked at her as if she were emotionally disturbed, which she was, because she was forced into a choice not of her choosing. It's the choices you're forced into choosing, and you realize you have to because you've decided so early and it's too late now to decide anything else. And so when Frank hides in the house and he's hearing her voice tell her how to put the pieces of of the actions of her death, like to clean everything up and put everything away, and then he doesn't hear her anymore, but it was gone. I've been in an empty house where I've heard the voices of my loved ones and they're gone, and you don't hear them anymore, and you don't know what to do. And so you do what you do until you're done doing it, and then you move on. And then the last chapter, it's broken down into two sections. Of part of it is Millie talking to the couple, the Braces, that have moved into the Wheelers' house. The Braces are the newly contaminated, the newly cardboard cutout people that'll fit into the ticky-tacky big boxes of their lives. And they'll do. They're the shiny happy people. And they'll be right. But now the Wheelers are gossip fodder. Since the Braces are now the ones with the superiority complex, or Millie's drawing them into it, the Braces, or the Wheelers, are now lower than the people that they think. It's like some backhanded compliment, not to the level of Mrs. Givings, but the fact that they're gossip fodder is unbearable to Shep. Millie is the one, and he says she's taking pleasure in it. It's something for her to talk about. It's something to lord over other people with. She has information, and she has the story. She had a front row seat to the whole story, and she can talk about this for years and years. And in the movie, they give her a little bit of mercy through Shep. He walks out and says, "I don't want to talk about the Wheelers anymore." And she says, "Okay." Like he gently makes her realize what she's doing. She's gossiping about these people that were quote unquote their friends, even though I think they had disdain for each other, both of them. But it's like, what happened to them could have easily happened to us, and it didn't. And we have to be lucky that we're here and we have each other. Even if we're just as unhappy as they were. We'll never say it because we don't even want the chance of what happened to them to happen to us. We're going to keep living in this hopeless emptiness because that's all we know and that's all we have. And we're grateful for that. And then it turns to Mrs. Givings, where something like this could very well alter her very being, but she's the kind of person that she won't let it. She is that, she's made herself that tough and that determined to not let it affect her the way it would affect a normal person, the way it would affect like a sensible person. She's gonna twist it and turn it not just into gossip, but into something to tidy and something to pick up, something that was wrong, and she's going to right it. She's going to address it in a way where the cardboard cutout braces are really congenial people. They're the people that are meant for that house. That house was meant for people who live the lives of the contaminated, of the people that are the modern nuclear family, that are always happy and that they're whitewashed, and they'll breed, and they'll have dogs, and they'll have sprinklers, and they'll have happy kids and rubber balls and blocks and books, and there, when I bring them sedum plantings, I won't find them in the basement. They won't be dead. And I think I had forgotten that part of the book where Mrs. Givings had to resell the house, and she found that the Wheelers had put the sedum plantings in the cellar because they didn't know what to do with them, and they forgot about it, and it had died. And that's sort of a metaphor for the Wheelers themselves. They had tried to they put themselves in a space so high up, and they thought of themselves as something else until they set themselves so far out away from everybody that they couldn't be seen anymore, and then they never were. And whatever they were is gone now, and it's dead. And so Mrs. Givings singles out the fact that they didn't do anything with my sedum plantings. Can you imagine if somebody takes the trouble to do that, give somebody a gift, and then they just throw it away? And she uses that as an excuse to dump all over the Wheelers. The Wheelers were a bit whimsical, a bit neurotic. They were very trying people to deal with. And so, she's going on and on and on. And in the book and in the movie, Howard Givings, we're focused on Howard Givings. And Howard looks at her as she's going on and on and on, like she does every day, this relentless force. And he has the gift of having hearing loss. And the last bit of the book, the last paragraph is, "But from there on, Howard Givings heard only a welcome thunderous sea of silence. He had turned off his hearing aid." It makes you wonder how he probably did do that every day and just let her go on and on and on. And because how else are you supposed to deal with a situation like that? But he's in prison too, not just with her, but they're the aged couple in the story that have lived this life, and they're going to die with this life. But he has the choice to tune it out and see his son, deal with his wife, read his paper, and then hopefully die, which will be the merciful end to this perpetuation of perversity, this life. And that's Revolutionary Road. I thought I was going to look at the script more. And I'm sure there's a lot of things that I wanted to talk about and didn't. And I've talked for 3 hours now. But all I'll say is this is a fantastic book. Again, it's not a happy book by any means. But it's a book that was adapted into a movie that attracted me back to the book, and I've subsequently read everything else Richard Yates has written. And it's wonderful. And I could go on and on about it like Mrs. Givings, but I won't. And these are just my rambling opinions. They're open to interpretation, even to me, even as I get on in life. I think what Richard was going for was probably a lot of what he had encountered up to that point in his life, a lot of what he'd seen. People trying to keep it together if they're not putting it together. Because I imagine living through World War II, if you survived it, was hell and hellacious, and all you would want is a kind of peaceful, easy life. But in that, you created this artificial existence in which conformity and uniformity are another kind of animal, another kind of stripping away of individuality. And the question of, can you be an individual if you're in a marriage, I think is one that's very important. Can you arrive at a point in your life where you're comfortable with the fact of who you are as a person and what you're doing in your life, to allow room in your life for another person to share your life with, and for them to share theirs with you, and it be okay, that you don't lose yourself in another person, in a relationship, and then in a family, in a job or career, or if you're so unhappy with all those, you have an affair. Hopefully you never feel that loss to where you need to find an outlet that's destructive. Hopefully you never need an outlet in the first place. But and hopefully you realize the reality of being had, and having the ability to, if not struggle, then fight against it. Because there in that fight is where the hope of something else is. Whatever life you're living, if you're not happy, you have to change your life. And I'm guilty of not doing it. I'm guilty of bitching about it and not doing it, and then living the same life and wondering why it's not different. It's because you're not changing anything. And if you're single, that's more or less forgivable than if you made a decision to join your life with somebody else and then decide you're not happy with how your life has turned out, but you've chosen to be with somebody and glue your, combine yourself with another person's life, because your life is not just your life anymore, it's our life. And that's a big decision to be confident in. And it's not a decision I think most young people are ready for or even aware of, because they're still developing who they are. And I think most people are developing, finding out, exploring, expressing who they are and what they want to be and what they want to do with their lives. If you can do that in a marriage and be okay and be comfortable, I think that's great. But I think that's a luxury that few can afford to do. I think it's better if you do it yourself. It might be harder and lonelier, but unless you find somebody that you're truly in love with and can be vulnerable with and show them who you are, all the things you spend all your time not showing everybody, you have to show them. And then you can, and this is naive of me, but begin to live a more honest life. You don't have to waste all your time, all your years living a lie because it looks good. It fits the picture window. You don't have to live in the picture fucking window. You can live your life. You can live the truth if you can let yourself see it and want to change it. And I think somebody like April might have seen it. She saw it too late, and she had no choice but to involve her family in her proposition, because that was the only choice she had. She was a person of not many choices. So when people say April was selfish, she was a fucking woman. She didn't have many choices. And I know people get tired of hearing about that, but tough. She didn't. And blaming it on her childhood is a convenient excuse, but in a synopsis online, it reads that Frank essentially fobs off the kids to their aunt and uncle and is only perpetuating April's life. April was fobbed off. She had a visit from her dad, and he dug around for a cheap, toy he gave her instead of his time. You can give your kids everything, but if you don't give them yourself, you're creating this void in their hearts. And that's as they're growing and as they're becoming people, and they're going to be searching for that their whole lives. And I think that was the case with April. And to be fair with Frank, I think Frank was lacking in a sense of self. And I've gotten accused of being like a men's rights activist before, but I try to look at some things from the perspective of how the guy feels. And this is a people are very hard on April, but I think there should be empathy for Frank too. I think he was also a person who, before he could figure out who he was and what he wanted to do, he made choices, and those choices were like this tug of war rope that he'd never tugged at. He just conceded because it looked right. It felt right at the time. It smelled right. It fell in line with what everybody else was doing. It's what he felt he was supposed to be doing until he was confronted with the notion that maybe it wasn't what he was supposed to be doing. And he had to think about that because April put that forth, because she was struggling with herself. He had to question himself, and I don't think he liked that. But it's not fair of me to say that. Again, it's not fair of me to say that either of them are bad people. I think they were people, again, living in the times they were living in, trying to figure out why they were living the way they were, and figuring out that it didn't necessarily work for them and what they wanted to do. And they were two different people that wanted different outcomes, and it would never work. It's again, I love this book. It's a wonderful book. I don't remember if I've read it 2 or 3 times now. At least 2. It's a book I don't read often because it's devastating. It's a devastating book, but it's a beautiful book. and I highly recommend it. And if you've listened to any of this, thank you. I'm sure there were other things I wanted to say. In my Easter parade ramble, I said something about Emily yelling at Sarah and how she was wrong for that. And it's like she was mad at her for choosing this piece of shit husband, abusing her and like treating her like shit. And she was abusing her, and she was, but she was also trying to stand up for herself. But I think she was also, there was other agendas at play, but she was trying to stand up for her sister. I didn't mean for that to come off as like she was abusing her sister. She was yelling at her, but she was also mad at her for not standing up for herself. But getting back to Revolutionary Road, this I'm sad that a book like this will always be relevant. I think people will always be trying to figure out who they are, why they are, and where they fit in the world beyond the roles they were placed in from birth. And it's a terrifying prospect, having to figure out your destiny, if you want to take it that far, trying to figure out what it is you're supposed to do with the time you have. And if you're disturbed by it, you can feel disturbed, but by feeling grateful that you even have the time at all, but also questioning why and what for, and that you can question it is part of the miracle of it. And if you can be honest with yourself and everyone else, that's another kind of miracle. Even if it hurts, it's the truth. And if you can find somebody that you can be happy with, that's another miracle. And you can both be okay. That's another part of the miracle. Alas, when passion is both meek and wild. John Keats. Again, there are things I probably wanted to say and forgot and would forget, and as soon as I click end stream, I'm going to kick myself for not having said it. Again, this is a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. If you listen to any of my reading at all, thank you. This particular video has been a rambling of the book Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates, published 1961. It's a wonderful book. If you don't listen to my reading of it, please read it, or I recommend it. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening. And I think I'll be reading more of Richard's work down the line. I'll be reading something. Thanks for listening.